In 1927, the United States Supreme Court issued a ruling. They declared that 3 generations of imbeciles is enough. This ruling legalized the forced sterilization of tens of thousands of American citizens, the tool used to justify this atrocity, the weapon chosen to classify who was fit and who was unfit to exist. It was an IQ test. We believe in numbers. Numbers provide a sense of objectivity. But what if, from the very beginning, that measure was warped? What if it wasn't created to measure intelligence, but to justify exclusion? This is not a story about psychology. This is a story about a pseudo-scientific weapon, born of fear, and it reshaped our society. Its origins were surprisingly ordinary. In Paris, during the early 1900s, the psychologist Alfred Binet was given a practical task by the government: identify which students in the new public school system were struggling and needed special support. Binet did not believe in a concept of innate intelligence. He just wanted to help children. His tests focused on practical skills, designed to find those who needed intervention. Binet warned very specifically. He feared his tool would be misused to label children permanently, creating a brutal pessimism. He was disastrously right. When Binet's idea crossed the Atlantic, it fell into the hands of Henry Goddard. Was the director of a training school in New Jersey, and a fervent believer in a dangerous, emerging idea: the eugenics movement. Eugenicists believed that all social problems, poverty, crime, addiction, were the direct result of poor heredity. Their goal was to improve the human stock by preventing the unfit from reproducing. Goddard saw Binet's test and immediately violated its creator's core warning. He declared that this test measured a single, fixed, and hereditary trait. He labeled those at the lowest end of his scale morons, and he believed they were the root of all social problems. Goddard needed evidence to justify his eugenics, so he created it. In 1912, he published The Kallikak Family, a study that quickly became a best-selling scientific fraud. Goddard had photographs of a poor family retouched. They darkened the lines, smudged the eyes to make them look sinister, threatening, and innately dumb. Then he fabricated the story behind them. He claimed these were 2 lineages from the same Revolutionary War soldier, Martin Kajik. The line from the virtuous wife produced elite citizens. The line from a feeble-minded barmaid was rife with criminals and morons. It was a total fabrication, but it was presented as scientific fact. The public bought it. To fear of the feeble-minded menace spread. Armed with his flawed test and fraudulent research, Goddard aimed for his next target: Ellis Island, the gateway for millions of immigrants. To America, Goddard believed America was being polluted by inferior blood from Southern and Eastern Europe. He sent his assistants to Ellis Island to administer IQ tests to newly arrived immigrants. The scenario was absurd. Imagine you have just endured a weeks-long ocean journey, exhausted. You do not speak English. You are hungry, frightened, and utterly bewildered by the culture around you. Then a stranger hands you a test designed for Americans, asking questions about cultural references or social conventions you have never encountered, and claims its results will determine your fate. The results were predictably disastrous. Goddard claimed to have found alarming rates of feeble-mindedness among the new arrivals: 40% of Jewish immigrants, 50% of Hungarians, 46% of Russians. These numbers shocked the nation. They were not presented as evidence of language barriers or cultural shock. They were presented as irrefutable scientific proof that America was opening its doors to a wave of the genetically inferior. This data didn't just stay in libraries. It was sent straight to Washington, D.C., becoming a political weapon. This fear directly fueled the passage of the Immigration Restriction Act of 1924. The act established strict quotas based on national origin. It was designed specifically to block Jews, Italians, Slavs, and other groups whom eugenicists deemed inferior. The IQ test had become the nation's racial gatekeeper. But for eugenicists, stopping new arrivals was not enough. They wanted to cleanse the population already present. This led to the 1927 court case, Buck v. Bell. Carrie Buck was a young woman in Virginia. She was committed to a colony for the feeble-minded. Her crime: she was poor, and she had just given birth to a child out of wedlock, the result of a rape. Her mother was also in the institution. Virginia state authorities wanted to sterilize Carrie, arguing she was morally and intellectually feeble-minded and would pass those traits to her children. The case went to the Supreme Court. In an 8-1 decision, the court sided with the state. Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, a respected figure, wrote the chilling words in the majority opinion: 3 generations of imbeciles is enough. That ruling legalized compulsory sterilization. It paved the way for more than 30 states to pass similar laws, leading to over 60,000 American citizens being sterilized against their will. But its legacy is even more sinister. When the Nazis began building their own eugenics laws in the 1930s, they looked for inspiration. They looked to the United States. Nazi legislators praised America's immigration and sterilization laws as a progressive model. The writings of Goddard and other American eugenicists were cited approvingly in Germany, used to justify their own racial hygiene programs. Those programs began with sterilization and ended in the gas chambers. When World War II ended, the world witnessed the final consequences of eugenic ideology. The Nuremberg trials exposed, in systematic detail, the brutality of the Nazis. The racial hygiene laws they had once praised, laws they drew inspiration from in the United States, led directly to the gas chambers. The name eugenics became toxic, synonymous with genocide. People like Goddard and his research were quickly disavowed by mainstream science. One would think this was the end, that the movement's core tool, the IQ test, would be discarded as a shameful relic of a pseudo-scientific era. They were wrong. It didn't die, it just changed its name. Goddard's legacy was too useful to be eliminated. The idea of a single number that could measure a person's worth was too powerful a sorting tool. It just needed a new coat of paint, and that coat of paint was called meritocracy. After the war, America boomed. Millions of soldiers returned, and the GI Bill opened universities to a new generation. Universities needed a way to screen them. They needed a tool that looked objective, democratic, one that didn't carry the stigma of eugenics. They needed something scientific. They turned to the Scholastic Aptitude Test, or the SAT. The SAT was not a new invention. It was a direct descendant of the wartime IQ tests. Its creator, Carl Brigham, was, like Goddard, a fanatical eugenist. In the 1920s, Brigham wrote an influential book, A Study of American Intelligence. In it, he analyzed the results of military IQ tests and came to an alarming conclusion. He declared that the Nordic white race was superior, and that mixing with inferior races like the Alpine, Mediterranean, and especially the Negro would lead to national decline. His book, like Goddard's research, was used as evidence to push for the Immigration Act of 1924. Now, in the 1950s, this very man and his tool were tasked with determining who deserved an American college education. The IQ test had been disguised. It no longer overtly measured hereditary fitness. Instead, it measured aptitude. But the problem remained. The test was still a mirror of privilege. The questions were designed by a small group of wealthy, white, East Coast men, and they reflected their world. The tests were filled with vocabulary and concepts about aristocratic sports, like yachting or steeplechase, things utterly foreign to most Americans. For a kid at Princeton, it was common knowledge. For a kid in the South Bronx, it was a barrier designed to keep them out. The test did not measure intelligence. It measured how wealthy your family was. But the number it produced was seen as objective, and that number became a new gatekeeper, even more effective than Ellis Island. When the Civil Rights Movement won its great legal victory in 1954, Brown v. Board of Education, the Supreme Court ruled that separate but equal segregation in schools was unconstitutional. Legally, schools had to integrate, but on the ground, the IQ test provided a backdoor. As black and white students were brought into the same buildings for the first time, school administrators used IQ and aptitude tests to implement a new form of segregation. It was called tracking. The results were immediate. Based on these objective numbers, white students were placed in advanced college prep classes. Black and minority students were shunted into low-level vocational tracks, told they weren't smart enough. The Supreme Court had banned segregation at the front door, so school administrators used the IQ test to bring it back in through the classroom window, disguised in the cloak of science. Segregation was removed from the school's front door, only to be brought back, and this time it was justified in the objective language of psychological science. This was the true legacy of Goddard and Brigham in the latter half of the 20th century. It was no longer the overt sterilization of Buck v. Bell. It was more subtle. It was the sterilization of opportunity. A child at 7 or 8 years old was given a test. That test produced a number, and that number would dictate the rest of their academic life. It told teachers whether they were worth investing time in. It told the child themselves what their value was. The number became a self-fulfilling prophecy. If you're told you are inferior long enough, you begin to believe it. The weapon had changed. It was no longer the eugenics surgeon's scalpel. It was the number 2 pencil and the answer sheet. But its purpose remained the same: to sort, to exclude, and to maintain a social order where some were destined to lead and others were destined to follow. The eugenics machine had not been destroyed. It had simply been embedded into the education system, where it continued its work, quietly and effectively. Beneath the fair surface of SATs and aptitude measures, Goddard's core argument never really went away. The idea that some groups of people are, genetically, simply less intelligent than others. It was just waiting. In the 1980s and early 1990s, debates over welfare and urban crime were raging. Critics of social programs needed a scientific reason to explain why inequality persisted, even after legal barriers had been removed. They needed to argue that the problem wasn't in the system, it was in the people themselves. The moment was ripe. And then, in 1994, the bomb dropped. It was caged, the bell curve, written by psychologist Richard Herrnstein and political scientist Charles Murray. This was not a fringe pamphlet. It was a massive, 800-page tome, published by a major press and heavily promoted. It took Goddard's eugenics from the shadowy labs of the 1910s and put it squarely on the New York Times bestseller list. The argument of the bell curve was both simple and brutal. It claimed that intelligence, measured accurately by IQ and SAT tests, was the single most important predictor of success in life. Not family wealth, not education, your innate IQ number. It determined your income, your likelihood of committing a crime, your chances of being a good parent. Then, the book took the next step. The same one Goddard and Brigham had taken before. It claimed this intelligence was largely genetic. And here was the explosive part. Murray and Herrnstein dedicated a chapter to presenting data on IQ differences between races. They repeated the exact same old claims, now dressed in modern statistical language. Asian Americans, they said, had the highest average IQ, followed by white Americans, and at the bottom, Black Americans, with an average they claimed was significantly lower. The message was clear. Social inequality was not the result of discrimination or systemic oppression. It was the result of unchangeable biological differences. The political impact was immediate. The bell curve became a Bible for those who wanted to dismantle social programs. If some groups were innately cognitively deficient, then why waste money on programs like Head Start or remedial education? Why try to promote diversity in universities through affirmative action? If those students were fundamentally not qualified, the book provided the pseudo-scientific justification to give up on entire segments of the population. It argued that social stratification wasn't just fair, it was biologically inevitable. Real scientists reacted with outrage. They pointed out that the authors had cherry-picked their data, that they had massively overstated the role of genetics, and almost completely ignored the power of environment. They pointed out the obvious that IQ tests do not measure innate intelligence. They measure exposure to the dominant culture, quality of schooling, nutrition, and parental wealth. The very IQ gap the bell curve highlighted wasn't evidence of genetics. It was evidence of systemic oppression. It was a map of segregation, poverty, and denied opportunity the very things the IQ test had been used to maintain for nearly a century, and the scientists were right to react so fiercely. This was not an objective study. It was a funded piece of advocacy. Much of the funding behind their research came from the Pioneer Fund. This was not a neutral organization. The Pioneer Fund was established in 1937 with the explicit goal of promoting eugenics, funding research into white racial superiority. The same ideology that had funded the same ideology that had inspired the Nazis was now funding the best-selling book on American social policy. History wasn't just repeating itself. It was being paid to repeat itself, but the damage was done. The bell curve did what Goddard could only have dreamed of. It made the discussion of race and intelligence a mainstream topic. It armed policymakers with an objective reason to justify inequality. It reinforced the faith in the number, the belief that a person's worth could be distilled into a score, and that the score was destiny. The weapon was no longer just in the hands of sterilizing doctors or school administrators. It was on the desks of senators. It was injected into the national debate, shaping laws that would affect millions. Bennett's monster had escaped the lab and was sitting in the halls of power. If the IQ test was a rifle aimed at individuals, artificial intelligence is a weapon of mass destruction. Today, we don't need a number 2 pencil test to generate a fateful number. The system does it for us, invisibly, thousands of times a day. Corporations and governments no longer need to justify their decisions with controversial eugenic theories. Instead, they have a new, much more powerful shield, the algorithm, a mathematical black box that they claim is completely objective. Take the criminal justice system. Risk assessment algorithms are now used across America to predict the likelihood that a defendant will reoffend. A judge looks at this risk score to decide bail and sentencing. But what is the data the algorithm learns from? It's historical arrest data. If police in the past have over-policed black neighborhoods, leading to higher arrest rates for petty crimes, the algorithm learns that black neighborhood equals high risk. An investigation by ProPublica confirmed this. They found one of the most widely used tools was severely biased. It was nearly twice as likely to falsely label black defendants as future high risks than white defendants. This is not objective justice. This is automated racism. Consider how it works in another field. An algorithm is trained on historical data to predict the future. For example, an AI system used in hiring, it is fed the resumes of all successful employees from the last 10 years and told to learn what to look for. It sounds fair. But what if for the last 10 years, that company has overwhelmingly hired white men from elite universities? The algorithm doesn't learn to find the best. It learns to find white men from elite universities. It has learned the systemic bias of the past. And this is the danger. When the algorithm rejects a qualified female applicant or an applicant of color, the company doesn't say, "We rejected you because of your race or gender." They say, "The algorithm determined you were not a good fit. Goddard's number has been automated." This is the digital Ellis Island. Instead of a psychologist with a handwritten test, we have automated systems scanning our resumes, our credit histories, and even our social media posts. Instead of classifying us as morons, they classify us with a risk score, a credit score, or a suitability score. These scores are presented as mathematical fact, beyond question, but they are just a mirror. They reflect the society we live in, with all its inequalities and prejudices. What is most alarming is the abdication of responsibility. When the Supreme Court ruled in Buck v. Bell, Justice Holmes had to write down his justification. When Murray and Herenstein published the bell curve, they had to defend their data against public criticism. But when an algorithm makes a decision, who is responsible? The company says it's just math. The programmers say they just wrote the code, and the algorithm itself cannot explain its reasoning. It is a perfect black box for hiding old prejudices. Alfred Bennett wanted to create a tool to help children. He feared it would be misused to create a brutal pessimism. His fear has been realized in ways he could never have foreseen. From the forced sterilization of tens of thousands, to the rejection of millions of immigrants, to the tracking of children in schools, and now to the automation of inequality through algorithms. The story of the IQ test was never really about measuring intelligence. It was always about justifying power. It was a century-long attempt to create a scientific excuse for an unjust social order, to make discrimination look like destiny. Today, that weapon has become invisible, coded into the very infrastructure of our lives. It is more powerful than ever, because we no longer even see it. Thanks again, and see you in the next one.